All right, let's dive into Austrian constitutional law today.
Sounds good.
We're going to be looking at this system and how it balances individual freedom with having a strong and effective government.
A fascinating topic for sure.
It really is. And, you sent over some excerpts from Verfassungsrecht by Ullinger Eberhard.
Yeah.
And this is going to be our roadmap for this deep dive.
Great.
So if you're ready, let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so first things first, Austria is a federal republic.
It is.
Now, I know that term might sound a bit, boring, but it's really important.
Absolutely.
Because this structure is key to understanding how power is actually shared in Austria.
It really is. You can think of it like a puzzle.
Okay.
With the federal government holding certain pieces and then 9 individual states
Right.
called Bundesländer, and they hold the other pieces.
Bundesländer, okay?
Yeah.
So they have this power sharing system. But what's really interesting to me is how does Austria present a unified front to the rest of the world?
Well, that's where the concept of Gesamtstaat comes in.
Gesamtstaat, okay.
Yeah, it basically means overall state. And it emphasizes that even though Austria has this internal division of power, they still act as one unified nation on the international stage.
I see. So it's like they're a team, maybe like a football team or a soccer team,
Yeah, good analogy.
where everyone has their own special position.
Right.
But when it comes to playing the game, they work together towards a common goal.
Exactly.
So they've got this intricate power sharing system.
Right.
But what happens if there's a disagreement? Let's say, one state wants to implement a stricter environmental policy than what the federal government wants.
Yeah, that's where things can get interesting.
Right. I mean, is it like a showdown?
Well, not exactly. Austria has a really unique approach to this.
Okay.
They use something called Bundesgrundsatzgesetz, or framework laws.
Bundesgrundsatzgesetze.
It's a mouthful, I know.
Okay, framework laws. So how do those work?
Well, imagine the federal government sets some broad goals, like big picture stuff for, say, environmental protection.
Okay.
And then the states, they take those broad goals and they figure out the details, how to actually implement them in their own specific areas.
Oh, so it's like the federal government gives them the outline,
Uh-huh.
and then the states, they're the ones who color it in, so to speak.
Exactly. It's a really clever way to balance national direction with the flexibility that states need.
That makes sense.
But even with this system, you can still have disagreements pop up sometimes.
Of course. So who steps in to resolve those? Like, is there some kind of Austrian Supreme Court?
They have the Constitutional Court, or VFGH.
VFGH, right?
And it's a powerful body. They make sure that both the federal government and the states are staying within their constitutional limits, and they sort out any disputes that arise.
So it's like a system that is designed to make sure no one has too much power. That's really interesting. So we've got this federal structure in place, but now let's talk about how Austrians actually govern themselves. From what I understand, it's a parliamentary democracy, is that right?
That's right.
Which means that the government is directly accountable to the elected legislature.
It does.
So the people's voice is really at the heart of this system.
Absolutely.
And this brings us to the Austrian parliament.
Right?
Okay, so I'll be honest. When I hear the term bicameral parliament, my eyes start to glaze over.
It can be a little dry.
Can we just break it down and make this easy to understand?
Of course.
I think a lot of people listening might be in the same boat.
So think of it like the U.S. Congress.
Okay.
You have the National Council, which is kind of like the House of Representatives,
Right.
directly elected by the people, and they focus on passing laws.
Mhm.
And then you have the Federal Council,
Okay.
which represents the Bundesländer, more like the U.S. Senate.
Okay, I see. So 2 houses, each with its own distinct role.
That's the idea.
All right, that's a helpful analogy. So how do Austrians choose who gets to be in this National Council? Is it a first-past-the-post system like we have in the U.S., or is it something different?
It's a bit different. Austria uses proportional representation. So it's not winner take all. Instead, the number of seats a party gets in parliament is proportional to the number of votes they receive in the election.
Okay, so it's meant to be much more representative of, all the different political views in Austria.
Exactly. It's designed to capture that diversity.
Which makes sense. But I know that proportional representation, sometimes it can lead to these kind of messy coalition governments. Does that happen in Austria?
It definitely can.
Okay.
After an election, the party or coalition with the most seats, they usually form the government, and it's called the Bundesregierung.
The Bundesregierung, okay.
And the leader of that party or coalition, they become the chancellor.
So the chancellor is kind of like the prime minister in other systems.
You got it.
But this is where I think things get a little tricky. The Austrian constitution has this thing It's a provision for a caretaker government.
Right.
And I don't really understand how that works.
Well, it's basically a way to make sure that the government keeps running smoothly during those transition periods, like between elections or if there's some political crisis.
That's actually pretty clever. So it's like a safety net.
You could say that.
Okay, so that makes sense. But all of this, it all sounds a bit theoretical, How does Austria actually ensure that the government is accountable to the people? What's to stop them from just doing whatever they want?
Well, that's where the National Council comes in.
Okay.
They have a lot of tools to keep the government in check.
Like what?
Well, they can question government ministers, conduct inquiries, and even pass what's called a vote of no confidence, which can force the entire government to resign.
Wow.
And if it's a really serious situation, they can even impeach the president.
So they've got some serious power. But in reality, how often does this actually happen? I mean, do we see these checks and balances being used all the time, or are they more like a last resort?
That's a great question, and it really highlights the difference between, well, the rules and how politics actually work in the real world.
Okay.
You see, in practice, political parties are often very disciplined, which means that things like no confidence votes and impeachment are very, very rare.
So the checks are there, but they're not used all that often.
You got it.
Okay, let's move on to something that I think affects every Austrian citizen directly, and that is fundamental rights.
All right.
The Austrian Constitution, it seems to really go to great lengths to protect individual freedoms.
Absolutely. These Grundrechte, as they're called, are a cornerstone of the Austrian system.
Grundrechte,
Yeah.
those are the fundamental rights.
Right.
And it's not just the Constitution, right? Austria also draws on the European Convention on Human Rights
They do.
and rulings from the Constitutional Court
Right.
to really build up those protections.
Yeah, it's a multi-layered approach, and it creates a very robust framework for protecting individual liberties.
So what kind of rights are we talking about here? Could you give me some specifics?
Sure. We're talking about freedom of movement, freedom of speech, the right to privacy, property rights, the right to a fair trial.
Yeah.
It's essentially a guarantee that every person has certain rights that the government can't just take away.
And I imagine those rights are pretty important in a free and democratic society.
They are the foundation.
But what happens when those rights clash with other interests? Like, what if the government thinks that they need to limit some freedoms in the name of public safety? Do individual rights always win out in those situations?
Well, that's where the principle of proportionality comes into play.
Proportionality.
Yeah, it's not a black and white situation.
Right.
If the government wants to limit a fundamental right, they have to have a really good reason.
Huh?
And whatever limitation they put in place, it can't be overly broad or restrictive. They have to find that balance.
So they can't just restrict rights without a good reason.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot.
And who decides if a limitation is actually justified?
Well, this is where the Constitutional Court comes back in.
Okay.
They play a crucial role.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that citizens, they can actually go directly to the Constitutional Court if they believe that their fundamental rights have been violated.
So they have a direct line to the highest court in the land.
They do.
That's
It's
incredible.
a powerful mechanism for protecting individual rights.
Do you have any examples of how this works in real life?
There's a really interesting case. It's called the Lenkeros-Kund case.
Okay.
It shows how this all plays out. So the Constitutional Court, they actually struck down a law that required drivers to tell the police who was driving their car at a specific time.
Really?
Yeah, they said it was a violation of the right to privacy.
So privacy won out in that case.
Initially, yes, but the story doesn't end there.
Oh, there's more.
The government, they went back and revised the law. They added some safeguards to protect privacy, and then the Constitutional Court accepted the revised version.
Interesting. So it was this back and forth. And
Exactly.
so they found that middle ground.
Right.
But this brings up another question for me. What if a law is considered constitutional when it's first passed, but then as society changes, it becomes clear that it's no longer really appropriate? What happens then?
That's a great question, and that's where the concept of invalidation durch Zeiteblauf comes in.
Okay. Invalidation durch Zeiteblauf. Break that down for me.
So it basically means invalidation through the passage of time.
Okay.
It's the idea that even though a law might be okay when it's first enacted,
Mm-hmm.
if it becomes outdated or no longer justified, it can be struck down later, even years later.
So a law can be constitutional at one point and then later become unconstitutional.
Exactly. It highlights the fact that the Austrian Constitution is a living document. It evolves as society changes.
That's pretty fascinating.
It is. It shows that they really value adaptability and keeping the Constitution relevant.
So we've talked about protecting rights, ensuring accountability, and that brings us to another key element of the Austrian system: checks and balances.
Right.
So these checks and balances are in place to make sure that no one branch of the government becomes too powerful, right?
Exactly.
To prevent tyranny, basically.
That's the idea.
So who are the key players in this system?
Well, we've already talked about the Constitutional Court.
Right.
They're kind of like the guardians of the Constitution.
Uh-huh.
They make sure that the laws passed by the Parliament are actually in line with the Constitution.
Okay.
They also resolve those disputes between the federal government and the states that we talked about earlier.
So they're like the referees, making sure everyone's following the rules.
A good way to put it.
But it can't just be one institution, right?
Hmm.
Who else is involved?
Well, you also have what's called the Administrative Court.
Okay.
And they provide what's called judicial review of administrative actions.
So let me get this straight. If a citizen feels like they've been treated unfairly by, let's say, a government agency, they can actually appeal to the administrative court.
That's right.
Wow. So it's another layer of protection
Exactly.
against the government overstepping its bounds. And there's another one, right? The Ombudsman Board.
That's right.
Tell me about them.
So they investigate complaints against the administration, and they act as a neutral third party to address what's called maladministration.
So, like, if someone thinks that a government agency isn't doing its job properly, they can go to the Ombudsman Board.
That's the idea.
Wow, it really seems like Austria has put a lot of thought into preventing any one person or entity from having too much power.
Absolutely. It's a really intricate system of checks and balances, all designed to protect individual rights and ensure that the government is accountable to the people.
Now, this brings me to a question that I've been thinking about.
Okay, what is it?
How does Austria handle being a member of the EU? Because being part of the EU, it means that they have to share some of their sovereignty, right, and navigate this whole other layer of, laws and politics.
Right.
So how do they balance their national identity with being part of this larger entity?
That's a great question, and it's one that we're going to dive into in part 2 of this deep dive.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.